week in English 750, topics in textual criticism, information, literacy, and revolution across the 14th century, we dove into thinking about the impacts of the internet, computers, and the digital age with Nicholas Carr's book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, The Shallows. So what does this have to do with medieval era literature and culture, you might be thinking? Well, throughout the semester, we've been thinking about the impacts of Gutenberg's printing press, which was invented around 1440, and how the printing press was a massive revolutionary invention that deeply affected society and reading. Well, for our era, the internet is bringing about change in our reading habits and brains, just as the printing press did for those people of the past. Human history does seem to repeat itself a little bit, doesn't it? Well, for today's video, I'm going to dig a little deeper into the physical and material nature of books themselves, especially the Golden Legend, since we've talked quite a bit about that book in prior videos. So, without considering the content of the writing itself, which we talked about in depth last time, I'm going to consider the material experience related to reading, or, in the case of the internet and digital technologies, maybe something entirely different. For myself, I recently read The Golden Legend from the 1998 Penguin edition, which was a slick, smooth-feeling cover, which was enhanced by a vivid picture and imagery of a ship, an ocean, pope, or other religious figure, and an anchor that this religious figure was tied to, inviting thoughts of clerical figures being literally and physically anchored to their faith in the teachers of God, in a potentially unwavering nature. The book itself was pliable and bended. While reading, I pushed and manipulated the spine so that the book would remain open. My fingers brushed over the slightly bumpy paper as I read, smooth at first, but minusculely dimpled and rough when you felt more closely. I could feel the weight of the book within my hand as I turned the slightly yellowed pages, and I could make out the faint smell of must or dust that came from the book. The physical book, it felt tangible in my hands, and I felt connected to the material object, not only the object itself, but also the content within. Therefore, I'm making the point that the physical and material nature of the book as an object impacts our experience while reading, just as the content held within will affect us. And as Nietzsche realized, the impacts of the materials on his writing too, as he, quote, noticed a change in the style of his writing, end quote, once he obtained a machine writing ball versus a pen and paper. Additionally, he states that, quote, our writing equipment takes part in the forming of our thoughts, end quote. So, if that's true, then our reading equipment, either a scroll or a manuscript or a book or even a digital file, must play a part in forming our thoughts during reading too. So, last video, I considered how the experience might be changed if I read a different version of the Golden Legend in terms of content. But this video asks a slightly different question. How would my experience of reading the Golden Legend be affected by reading different versions that have varied material and sensory qualities? How does the physical object of the book impact my thinking as well as my reading experience? Ultimately, how does the material world affect us? So, personally, my book gives me comfort for all the physical attributes I spoke on before. The physical object in my hands makes me feel connected, more connected to the book, and more connected to the content. The book brings to mind libraries and reading as a child. It brings to mind a simpler time before our family got our first computer. The dust and must and smell of the paper makes me feel at peace. The object is rift with sensory experiences that enhance my reading. When underlining passages, I hear a faint psss as my pintail fine-tipped black pen makes an indent in the bumpy paper that I can feel and see when flipping to the next page. I see my pastel pink highlighter bleed into the fibers and disperse, not adhering to the straight lines that I create when I drag the felt tip across the page. I also hear like a whoosh sound as I drag it across. None of this happens in a digital file. Ultimately, I could hold my book against my chest and feel that it's really there. It's here, and I have it. It's not an intangible or ethereal file stored on my computer that could disappear or become corrupted at any time, just being lost. Of course, I could technically spill coffee on my 1998 Penguin edition of the Golden Legend and alter it that way, but it would still be here. I could certainly burn the book to alter the physical experience, but I don't have any intentions of doing that. That would just be blasphemy. So, by having my physical copy, I feel that I'm having an immersive and connected experience with the content of the Golden Legend itself, as well as an experience that connects me to reading as a child and a young adult. Reading this way just feels personal. However, I do know that many of my classmates decided to read the ebook files instead. These digital files consisted mainly of separate PDFs for each saint, and occasionally a link to Fordham University's medieval sourcebook collection of the Golden Legend. To say that I was put off by opening these files and web pages would be an understatement. Firstly, the fact that the saints' hagiographies were in separate files opposed to a collected ebook made them feel disjointed and disconnected opposed to being together in one book. Well, the anthology that I personally read gave a sense of cohesiveness to them. Next, the italic font hurt my eyes in the digital files, further putting me off from the digital version, which was not spaced out quite as much as the book itself, which made it harder to read, which also impacted the experience. The Fordham University version also had huge single-spaced paragraphs and walls of text that were off-putting. The act of scrolling through these files or websites did not give me the same comforting satisfaction as turning a book page. And highlighting instead with an Adobe Acrobat instead of a physical pen or highlighter did not produce those audible sensory experiences or noises that gave me a more tactile experience when holding a pen or a highlighter. The tapping of my keyboard as I made the notes in the Adobe file on the PDF was definitely quicker and more efficient than writing in the margins, but it did also noticeably change my experience. So, when writing in my physical book, I used short sentence fragments, lists of words, abbreviations, and generally made an attempt to express my thoughts as succinctly as possible. However, when making the notes in the PDF file comment feature on the digital Golden Legend, I wrote incomplete sentences, even using punctuation. This made sense as, quote, the use of any kind of tool can influence our thoughts and perspectives, end quote. My thought process literally changed from thinking, I need to be as brief as possible because this physical object only has limited writing room, versus on the PDF thinking, I can write as much as I desire because this comment box will just keep going on forever. It's true then that, quote, the tools we use to write, read, and otherwise manipulate information work on our minds even as our minds work on them, end quote. When we change the equipment or medium that we use to read or write, we are ultimately altering our reading and or writing experience too. This ultimately comes down to the different ways that material or even digital entities affect us. So Charles Spence from the University of Oxford Department of Psychology also speaks on the difference between print and digital reading, which I wanted to share with you all today. So, quote, the failure of ebooks to take over from the traditional print format, as so confidently predicted would happen only a few years ago, highlights how there is more to reading than merely the content of what we see. In fact, like any other object, the experience of interacting with a book, especially an old or historic volume, offers the reader the potential for a multi-sensory encounter, one that involves not only what the book looks and feels like, both the weight of the volume and the feel of the pages, but also the distinctive smell. In fact, one might also want to consider the particular sound made by the pages as they turned over, end quote. He therefore is also appealing to the materiality and material nature of the book itself, being an important element of the reading process. So, imagine that instead of reading the digital PDF file or the 1998 Penguin edition of the Golden Legend, that one was reading the saints' lives on an ancient scroll or manuscript, or even William Caxton's edition when he used the printing press. Each of these would produce a very different sensory experience too. For scrolls in particular, since, quote, as many as 20 sheets of paper could be glued end to end quote, the experience would be far more cumbersome than a book or codex. One would have to have ample room to unroll the scroll, have to be careful not to rip or damage the delicate paper, and would have to manage the unraveled scroll opposed to just simply turning the page. This would also surely alter the sensory experience, though it's not an experience that I've personally had. However, while I'm rather rough with my edition of the Golden Legend, I remember when I got to touch a 1685 folio from William Shakespeare. The material object was faded, yellow, and brittle. I used the utmost care as I gently turned the pages. The musty smell was magnified compared to books I'd encountered before, and the reading experience was not really one of comfort, but of awe and reverence and terror that I would harm the book itself, showing just varied experiences with different material objects or books. Therefore, I feel like this video is a companion to my last video on the content of the Golden Legend. Not only do the words within the pages themselves change our experience, but so does the physical book, scroll, or digital file itself too, making reading and writing a complex though very personal experience. So thank you all for turning in this week, and I'll see you next time. Farewell and happy reading, whichever method or medium works best for you.